Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Really glad to be here today. It is our final Global Cafe of the season. We will be renewing with an exciting program and series in the fall following the conference. And to close out our season, I am just thrilled to welcome Dr. Rayne Stroebel. And Rayne is the founder and owner of Geratech, Gerontological Research, Training, Education, and Care, the only company in South Africa wholly dedicated to providing services for older persons and the long-term care sector. With a strong commitment to enhancing the quality of life for older individuals, Rayne has played a pivotal role in transforming the care landscape for older persons in South Africa. In 2022, Dr. Stroebel earned his PhD in dementia studies from the University of Stirling in Scotland, and his doctoral research, Storying Elderliness, Rhizolinguistic Narrative Inquiry into Hangberg, South Africa, explored the narratives surrounding aging and dementia, offering valuable insights into the cultural and linguistic dimensions of elderhood. His work focuses on fostering dignity, inclusion, and purpose for those living with dementia. In 2010, he introduced the Eden Alternative to South Africa, a globally recognized philosophy of relationship-directed support aimed at enriching the lives of older persons and those who support them. And since then, he has trained over 4,000 caregivers, equipping them with the knowledge and skills necessary to create environments where older adults can thrive. Welcome, Dr. Stroebel.
Gosh, Gregor, thank you very much. What an introduction. I'm exhausted already.
Well, Rayne, I have had the distinct pleasure to get to know you a little bit over the last several months in South Africa, including sharing, I think, the finest fish and chips I ever had with a cold, frothy adult beverage at Fish on the Rocks in Hout Bay, just outside of Cape Town, where you did your PhD research. And I wonder if you might tell us a little bit about your journey and how you have come to be such a champion for the dignity and rights of older people.
Thanks, Gregor. Yes, I think the people who know me know my story that I had the fortunate or unfortunate childhood of growing up in what we call an old age home, a nursing home in other terminology, where my mother was in those days, I think for about 18 years, my mother was the matron of this very institutional establishment. And I thought that never in my life I would set foot in one of those again. And somehow, this was not a career choice. Somehow I just ended up doing this work. And the older I get, the more I realize that it is the things that I learned from my mother about dignity, about, a dignified life and a dignified death. And through a very strange road, which I will not share with you, I just came to where I am today. So it was preordained, none of my own doing. And the older I get, of course, having one foot on that side of the aging longevity spectrum, the more passionate I feel that we should all prepare for ourselves a better way of being in the world as we age.
Well, we have a couple of questions here, but what I wonder, could you tell us a little bit about how you ended up particularly in brain health, and share a little bit about your PhD study that just has such a powerful title, Storying Elderliness. And I know you worked there in that Hout Bay region with local people, and it was an extraordinary experience. I remember when I was in South Africa last, you drove me through the village, and it was a really remarkable experience for me. I wonder if you might tell us a little bit about that work and how that's translated into a focus on brain health in particular.
I'm a sad child of the apartheid era in South Africa, and just the demographics still to this day is 98% of the people who live in residential care in South Africa, 98% of them are white. And we use the classification still, even though it's not PC in our statistics in South Africa, referring to white people, black people, and colored people. And, it was very difficult in my PhD through the University of Stirling to actually have to justify why those terms are still used, but they are still used to this day. So I was intrigued to find out what the um, impact would have been on this aging community of colonialism and apartheid, and decided to look at a community that is very marginalized. And of course, with the Western focus on the risk factors for cognitive impairment, I was thinking that there would be a very high prevalence of cognitive impairment in this severely marginalized community, because all the risk factors would score 10 out of 10. So that was my first approach, is to look at the impact of colonialism and apartheid on how people age and what that did to cognitive health. Um, and very, very early on in my engagement with the people of Hangberg, I realized that I was so wrong. In fact, I did not find a single person there who was labeled or diagnosed with cognitive impairment. Realizing afterwards that if I had gone in with some sort of screening or assessment, I would have. But everyone was so integrated in this community, and they had this thing of interreliability and reciprocity. And in the absence of formal structures, because it is a marginalized community, there is so much of this interreliable connectedness, uh, dignity, because people have a purpose. So they might not know whether it's Monday or Boxing Day, but they have a purpose. They take the grandchildren to school. They do the fish and chips, and for no point, or at no point, was I romanticizing this, because in reality it's a very, very complex community. But the way that people aged in this community was so different. And I found that through the sense of purpose within community and intergenerational living, there was a very, very, very low percentage of cognitive impairment. So yeah, it's a study that I think could teach us a lot. But at the end of the day, I think this is something that the Western world has lost, is our ability to integrate intergenerational living. We try very hard, and we've got very, very clever processes to try and do that. But I do think to a large extent we've sadly lost that.
I'd really love to kind of get back to this in a minute and maybe connect that to the Eden alternative. But just maybe on our path there, I know you are so passionate about your city, your country, and being African and the continent of Africa. And Africa is often perceived to be a demographically very young continent. I believe roughly 9% of the population is over 65, which is lower than other continents. And even though by 2050 that will rise up to 13%, still being quite low from many other countries, that is still the second highest population of older people because the population is so high. So I think sometimes we miss, or we the way we interpret that data needs to be contextualized. But
Mm.
so what does that landscape of aging look like, and why should we be paying attention to aging in Africa?
So this is why everyone should come to the conference. Africa is a very, very young continent. We have this youth bulge, um, and there's a lot of focus on youth. So what happens is that often, aging is invisible. It's invisible in policies. Invisible in infrastructure, and that's why we also are so passionate about looking at creating age-friendly environments in Cape Town and well, the whole of South Africa. But older people are often invisible, and the formal care systems in many African countries are quite weak. But what we see, and this is what I'm so passionate about, thanks to our learned friend Professor Jaco Hofman, is that we have this emergence of new forms of aging, and that was what was so fascinating in my study as well. Is without romanticizing the reality of aging in South Africa, or Africa for that matter, uh, we have this emergence of new forms of aging. Thanks to HIV/AIDS, we have a skipped generation, which means that many older persons are primary caregivers for their grandchildren. Now that comes at a price, but it also, there are some very, very interesting emerging contextualities that come as a result of that. We also have a very high percentage of child-led households. So again, there is this reciprocal care where older persons often are primary caregivers for grandchildren, but grandchildren also learn to engage with and care for older persons. We sit with a 60% youth unemployment in South Africa. And a lot of times, the youth are dependent on the grandparents for livelihood, for shelter, for day-to-day living. So there's a very interesting dynamic that emerges in that intergenerational connection. Also, the socio Africa, people care for their elders and whatever. We have to unpack that. It's challenged by migration, which has always been a problem or a challenge in Africa. Definitely in South Africa, people will have to leave their residence to go and be employed somewhere else. So we have, migration, economic status, unemployment, that challenge, aging. But with that comes, new solidarities, new ways of engaging with aging, which is what I saw in my research, and a life course approach. It's not suddenly we wake up here and we're old. There is this intergenerational, reciprocal interreliability, which I think the West can learn from. And that's again, it might sound like a bit of an advertisement for the conference, but come and see what Africa does. Come and feel what Africa does. Because I think what the media says about Africa and what you will feel as you did when we went for fish and chips in Hungary is so different. We've got a lot to learn from what is happening on the ground here in this emergence of new approaches to aging and long-term care.
I guess that's really interesting. Well, it is really must be fascinating to explore within the context of unstructured, or the absence of structured systems, especially like in the informal settlements, communities, uh, and how that you've mentioned before, the entrepreneurial resilience and the adaptability that they could you maybe speak to that, and how that resilience, that creativity, that entrepreneurial spirit is reflected in the lives and communities of older people?
Yeah, so for instance, a simple example within the Hangberg community, the Department of Health closed down the clinic. Now, the clinic was a meeting point. A lot of people went to the clinic, older persons especially, knowing that on that particular day they're not going to perhaps see the sister or the doctor, but they went there as a meeting point. Due to politics and bureaucracy, the Department of Health overnight closed the clinic. So now those people have to travel into the village, by taxi or by bus or being taken by someone. And it costs them money to now go to the clinic in the town. And let's call it what it is, the white part of town, where there's no meeting place. They sit outside in the blazing sun or the pouring rain. And the community mobilized itself, where there's for instance a bus stop that is a bit of a shelter in Hangberg, and community healthcare workers would set up their own little clinic there where they take blood pressure. They would cut those toenails of the person living with diabetes or whatever. And it's just, entrepreneurial spirit of, yeah, we can fight about the clinic that's closed, but let's make a plan. The service center that I worked with has existed for 58 years. In August this year, that service center for older persons celebrates 58 years. In my conversations with some of the ladies, they said, yeah, many years ago, a white woman came here with some forms for us to complete. And we said, no, we don't want to complete any forms. But they've sustained themselves in a very healthy way for 58 years, where they get together once or twice, winter, summer, in summer twice a week, in winter once a week. And it's quite extraordinary what they do with no funding, no resources, as part of this entrepreneurial, we make the best of what we have, which, yeah, that is civil society. That is people saying, let's take ownership of who we are and where we want to be.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. You know, you're in this work with under-resourced or marginalized communities in South Africa, and in your work advocating for rights, especially for those living with cognitive or neuro and cognitive impairment. You've reflected a lot on our way of being in the world, on connectedness, and you mentioned earlier this intergenerational interreliability. Can you just talk a little bit more about that, and maybe about how do we move from this kind of transactional caregiving model to a more relational, maybe presence way of being, which I think is what
Yeah.
you're moving towards when you speak of that.
I run the risk of becoming very philosophical about this, but this is where the Eden alternative comes in, is to go through a change of culture, which is very difficult. We know that. Um, the Eden alternative advocates for a culture of relationality. Also, the work done by Andries Baart and Gijs Timmerman on relationality in care. So what is that? That is a need for well-being. So often in the long-term care sector, or in whichever guise or form, we focus on disease deficits, aging in that ageist paradigm. The great tsunami, the care burden on the world economy. I think in the relational caring and the well-being narrative, we look at older people as resources and assets. And for that, we need to look at the seven domains of well-being, which is about identity. Um, how do we identify? This is a big thing amongst the youth, but how do older people identify? How do they narrate their own story? And this is where ageism is so dangerous. There's one thing about the ageism of society, but this internalized ageism, and the internalized ageism is narrated through the stories that we tell about ourselves, how we present and narrate our being in the world. So identity, connectedness, meaning, joy, autonomy, growth, security, those focal points. And you can have different points of entry. That's where the rhizomatic inquiry becomes so interesting, because a person might, feel very low in terms of their sense of identity, But if they have a strong sense of meaning, that will contribute to a stronger sense of identity. And it's this Venn diagram of interconnectedness between the domains of well-being. Again, I need to reiterate, a lot of people say to me, you know, I'm an advocate for there is no such thing as the suffering. Of course it's there. My approach is to say, let's take stock, and then let's try and find these domains of well-being. And we all have that yearning, that desire for a sense of well-being. But how do I define it? And how do I then narrate it, both in narrating my own story, but also in this relational connectedness between you and I? What do I hear you say? How do you frame me? Tom Kitwood talked about personhood. The status that is bestowed upon someone within the context of this relational caring. Do I refer to this person as demented? Or do I talk about neurocognitive impairment? Do I talk about a patient or a person? That medical gaze, the objectifying of aging, those things are so crucial. And I'm doing a lot of work, or have based my work on the work of Professor Sinfree McConey from Penn State University in linguistics. Is about the language we use create the world that we live in.
Mm. That's a powerful statement. Say the language we use creates the world we live in.
Yes,
Mm.
words in the Eden alternative golden rule. One of them is words make worlds.
Mm. Well,
Words make worlds. If I give you the identity, the status of a patient, you will act like a patient. If I give you the status of demented, you will take on that label if that is the only sense of identity that you have. So personhood is the status that is bestowed upon us by others within the context of relational caring. It implies respect, recognition, and trust. That in my vulnerability, Gregor, I can trust that you will still honor my sense of identity by not labeling me as old, decrepit, whatever the case may be. So it's the bi-directional reciprocal relationality. So also then the problem is, as I said, we've got this external ageism, but the internal ageism, when I start taking that on board, and I believe that I'm old and decrepit because that's what the world tells me, instead of being an activist and saying I'm not going to take on that label.
Yeah, yeah. It's just so interesting because the often ideas around personhood, which, as you know, is an interest of mine, and was my background was in,
Mm.
is that oftentimes our identity is the constellation of relationships that we belong to. And often when we lose someone that's very close to us, a spouse or a family member, we're not just mourning a loss, but we're also rediscovering who we are from the absence of that role, presence, narrative of who we are that tells us who we are and helps us find meaning and engagement. And so what you're saying is, so that happens often with people as they lose somebody, but when you're
Mm.
maybe moved into institutional care or engaging with caregivers who are starting to, in some cases, replace or fill the roles of these new people, if you're just treated like you're saying as a patient or as a demented person, the effects could just be must be very powerful. And is this this is the I guess some of the meat and potatoes of the Eden alternative? Am I correct? Could you
Absolutely.
maybe just
Yeah.
sort of help
Yeah.
us?
So
What
the
is the
Eden
Eden
alternative
alternative?
is, yeah, when Bill Thomas started, as he was saying, institutionalizing older persons, for the mere fact that they're old. Uh, presents with what we see now over and over in the world: loneliness, helplessness, boredom. And he called those the three plagues of institutional aging: loneliness, helplessness, and boredom. And the antidote to that is the culture movement of saying, we create a human habitat. And a human habitat is about relationality. I am, and this is Ubuntu. In the African context, this thing is called Ubuntu, that says, I am because you are. No man, no woman is an island. I am because you are. So it's about the relationality. Our being in the world is defined. As you say, today I am someone's husband. Tomorrow I am a widow or a widower. Today I am, my mother died recently. I always thought I'm so privileged at my advanced age to still have my mother alive. And then suddenly when she died, I realized, oh my God, I'm an orphan. Now, how can you be 60 and an orphan? I felt like a motherless child. So, yes, our identity is not static, it is constantly evolving. But, how much autonomy do I have in this ageist world to, you know, create a sense of well-being through these domains of well-being? Or how much am I a passive recipient
Mhm.
of the care task, the transactional care, for instance, um, that is becoming more and more transactional? So I believe that this culture change and the culture change movement of the Eden, whatever the philosophy is a crucial part of my being in the world. And my being in the world is not necessarily dictated by my doing in the world. And as you can hear, I can carry on for hours about presence. Andries Bart being the father of the theory of presence, and he says we cannot teach people how to care. We cannot teach people how to care. Care is a human instinct. Mothers, we care. That's what makes us human. And the biggest gift that you could give another human being, your wife, your partner, your children, the man begging at the traffic light, is your presence. Because that is to say, I see you.
Mm.
There's nothing I can do for you, but your presence acknowledges my being in the world. Isn't that profound?
Oh, yes, very rich. Yeah.
Not because I said it, Andries Bart said it, but I find it so powerful.
Yeah, very much so. Very much so. It really draws on the rich work of uh, philosophers like Heidegger and so on, who,
Absolutely.
that you don't you see the world in many cases as everyone is a object and you're the subject. But it's only when
Mhm.
you, in his, he has a great discussion around it's when you make eye contact, when you are seen by the other, that suddenly the other to you is no longer just an object, they're a subject. And you have this deep relational moment
Absolutely.
where you are claiming your identity in the
Yeah.
moment that you are seeing the other and the other is seeing you. It's a very rich conversation. And
And it's that is sacred. I just have to throw that in there. That is sacred.
Nakaniso Kumalo, apologize if I've mispronounced your name, notes that is just confirming what you said, and she writes in the chat in isiZulu ise umuntu ngumuntu ngabantu, which directly translates, as you say, I am because we are, and she says this concept guides all that we do.
Amen. Yes.
Thank you for that. I think we'll maybe just move to a couple of questions that are in the chat, Rayne. It's quite active out here. Shmuel asks, how interreliability approach can improve social and mental well-being of older persons from low and socioeconomic groups or populations, but also asks, how interreliability can support, how does it actually support the reduction risk of dementia and other cognitive diseases?
Well, that's what I think was for me so interesting in my research, where I was expecting a very high prevalence or incidence of cognitive impairment, and found that even though, as I say, if we went in with a Western screening, we might have found a high scoring. The day-to-day engagement and interacting, and literally the fact that the grandchildren are reliant on grandmother for their care, for coming home to have a plate of food on their table, which comes from an incredibly small social grant. That giving the grandmother a sense of purpose, you know, plays into, a lesser risk of cognitive impairment. Okay. It's not that simple that it's just this one aspect, but that being in the community, that sense of connectedness and meaning and joy, identity, that would keep people functional within community much, much longer. And I can almost guarantee you that if you take that person and you put them in an institution, you will disable them within weeks
Mm.
because they lose their sense of purpose.
Hmm. It really, again, really solidifies this taking a life course approach,
Yes.
because you can't suddenly fix this kind of investment in our the very way we self-reflect and are together in society, when you suddenly become older and try to train healthcare workers to grasp this philosophy and change their, it's a whole life course approach, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah. Gregor, and I want to distinguish between interdependence and interreliability. And we won't go into that. I just would like the listeners to think about it, um, because there's a distinct difference in my uh, experience between interdependence and interreliability. A lot of people say it's semantics. I challenge you to go and think deeply about the difference between the two.
All right, a little homework assignment.
Yeah.
One, we'll follow up in the fall. Excellent. Masako is with us. Masako Osako is here. Hi, Masako. Great to have you with us. And she's asking, Rayne, would you discuss the national pension system in South Africa as a contextual factor? It's not well known outside of the country. Could you say a couple of words on that?
Yes, so we have a national pension fund for older persons, with certain criteria. I think it's just been increased. So I'm going to have to lie if I tell you the exact amounts, but it's a very small amount. And to contextualize it, as I said earlier, is that many households, and now this is going to be very interesting, where I catch myself at my own terminology. Many households rely on the pension of that older person for their livelihood. As I said, 60% youth unemployment, plus 1 in 4 women who have to leave their place of work in order to care for an older person, which means that pension grant that older people get feeds a family, holds a whole family together. Now, when I started my work, I was pretty horrified about it and thought, well, we should put a stop to this. Children are abusing elders. Of course, that happens. However, in my conversations with older persons, it came out over and over and over again what an empowering thing this pension is, so that I can do the fish and chips for my grandchildren. I can buy them a pair of school shoes. And this is why I say one distinguishes between interdependence and interreliability, because I rely on my grandchildren to keep me in the community. I rely on them to look after me and check in on me as much as they rely on me. So it's a very, very, very interesting thing. So there's a means test for this grant, older persons grant. And as I say, it's I think something like 3,200 Rand a month, which is, you can do the sums. It's very, very, very low. Um, but yeah, that is the context within which that happens.
I think that's, 60 to $100 USD a month, as a quick, just off the head. Jane Simmons notes that there's 9.7, almost 10 million children in South Africa that are living in multi-generational homes. That's nearly 40%,
Mhm.
which is a really a powerful witness to exactly what you're saying, Rayne.
Mhm.
Um, Rayne, you know, aging is still framed in many societies as a care burden. We look at the numbers. Especially I know in my culture, fast paced. Everybody is working, and in Canada, for example, we have a very high ratio of older people that move into long-term care. We had the highest rate of deaths in COVID-19 of all the G7 countries for death in long-term care. Um, you know, and friends that are with us advocating, like Margaret Gillis from ILC Canada and ILC Global, is such a voice and advocate for older people, even in high income countries. To your point, that we have so much to learn from communities like yours and our sisters and brothers in South Africa, of how we engage with older people as a society. How do you think we should be reimagining our policy conversations about things like pensions, retirement, productivity?
Oof.
How would you challenge these existing paradigms, and these values on aging?
It was interesting, and I don't want to offend anyone, but the other day I was watching the news and saw that France has now gone to a 3-day work, no, to a 70, the retirement age of 70. And I thought, yeah, well, that's all very well when you have a 3-day work week. Just joking, just joking. But that was the first thought that came to mind. I will also work until I'm 80 if I have a 3-day work week. I do think that globally we have to question, retirement age for its ageist implications. But also, one of the biggest issues that I find, Gregor, and I do a lot of work directly with older persons, and I do a lot of work on death and dying, is how unprepared the world is for this thing called aging. So I think, looking at the life course in South Africa, we have a huge problem with massive challenge with non-communicable diseases. So education, education, education. I know the World Health Organization has put out a lot of work around that. Um, that policy making is more educational in the life course, that we all become better educated about what it is that's going to happen to most of us. There's a beautiful beautiful joke that was told to me in the Jewish home that I worked in, where I said to someone, this thing of wishing someone a long life uh, in Jewish communities when someone dies. And it's in Yiddish, they say 120 Jahre und 3 Monate, which means 120 years and 3 months. And I asked one of the residents, but why the 3 months? And she says it will take you 3 months to get over the shock of being 120. So, this thing that we are wishing a long life, and we are advocating for a long life, but we're not prepared for it. Countries are not prepared for it, individuals are not prepared for it. So what will it look like in terms of policy, to prepare people? And of course, I think our fight against ageism is one of the biggest aspects of that. But individuals, population groups are just not prepared for this longevity. And I think that's where we need to look at policy and a big focus on education.
Jane Simmons, she brings up issues with comorbidity in South Africa, people living longer with HIV and non-communicable diseases. Jane, I wonder, would you just like to just maybe speak to that a little bit and maybe have a focused question for Rayne? Still,
Hi, sorry, I've in the car and on my phone and just unmuted myself. So afternoon all, and so much of this work and conversation resonates with the work that I work in an NGO called Go Gogo Go. And Gogo in South Africa is a grandmother. And our NGO is about building capacity in grandmothers raising grandchildren. But one of the things that we are trying to address is the health of these grandmothers who, as Ray and so many other the comments have pointed out, are raising these children and having to look after families of 10 people on the social grant of the $130 a month or $120 that it is. And I think what we're looking at is diabetes, hypertension, cardiovascular disease, cholesterol. All of these problems are creeping in with HIV, and we're faced with a massive pill burden in these communities where older people are having to take 20 or 30 pills a day. And the stress of that on their health is quite extraordinary. And we've done research on the role of the carers of these older people, often their grandchildren or their children, in handing out these pills. And you mentioned, Ray, earlier about the community clinic. And I mean, that is just an example of the resilience of South Africans. And thank you for sharing that story. But what are your thoughts on this polypharmacy and the treatment? How do we manage health in older people?
Jane, can we, extend the conversation for another 3 hours? One of my biggest challenges in residential long-term care, in working with older persons in the community, is polypharmacy. And I think it is as a result of the lack of knowledge about geriatric medicine. Um, I won't go into the detail of what I know the geriatric curriculum is for general practitioners in South Africa. It's shocking. So we do not have a geriatric medicine. We do not have geriatric training for caregivers or nurses. And the recourse, unfortunately, when an older person walks in, is to give them a pill. In fact, Professor Monica Ferreira, I think about 25 years ago, did research on this, where the research respondents at that time said, and all we get is a pill. And I think they called it the pink pill. So it's a grave reality. And when we look at, for instance, the nutritional status as measured with Nestle's mini nutritional assessment, any older person who takes more than 3 prescribed medication is already at a higher risk of malnutrition. Now we look at food insecurity as a result of poverty, and throw polypharmacy on top of it. It has got such incredible side effects, iatrogenic disorders, that ends up with a person who should actually be healthy and functioning not being so because of polypharmacy, as one aspect. I think they talk about a quadruple jeopardy, and I think we can add to that. It's being old, it's being poor, it is being, at the mercy of clinics that just prescribe. And then suddenly you go to the clinic and they don't have that medication. So you have to stop cold turkey. I see Sebastiana is on the on the podcast, on the conversation as well. She is an expert on this. So maybe Sebastiana, you want to add to this?
We'll, as Sebastian is getting ready, I think we just have one more little moment here for a comment. Margaret Gillis from ILC Canada and ILC Global.
I just want to first of all thank you, Rayne. This has been an amazing discussion, and I've worked in the field of ageism for probably 20 plus years, and I learned a lot today. And I think one of the things I learned was something that I kind of have lived and never thought about, which was really my connection to my own grandmother and her impact on my life. So what I'd really like to know a little bit more about is where can I find some more information about this research, because I want to think about it in the Canadian context. It brought up a lot of things. What's happening in Indigenous communities in Canada, and I suspect what you found in South Africa is likely happening there, and I would like to see if that's ever been explored. But also in terms of the work we're doing with the Canadian Coalition Against Ageism, I'd like to think about the, what you've taught us today, so that we can start to contextualize it a little more in our discussions on ageism. So where can I get more information? How can I get some of your studies? Where are they? Where will I get them?
So a lot of these studies are actually on our ILC South Africa website.
Great.
So it's just ilcsa.org. But there I can see now, I was telling Gregor, I'm wearing my multifocal, so it's very difficult to read on the screen and look, but I can see a lot of people here who are fellow researchers who, we can create a sort of a clearinghouse on that. But on the ILCSA website, all Sebastiana Kalula's research is on there. All Jaco Hofman's research is on there. And if you go and look at the earlier work of Professor Monica Ferreira on ageism, elder abuse, fascinating work that, is still as relevant, unfortunately, 25 years later as it was back then.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much. I'm continuing my lifelong learning as a result of this. So thank you.
Thank you, Margaret, for the work that you do.
Thank you. Maybe that's a great segue. Maybe Rayne, you'd like to just take a moment to think about what your closing statements would be, and maybe again, why people ought to be joining us in South Africa, in Cape Town in September for the conference. While you're thinking of that, I'll just let everybody again remind you that we will be pausing now for the summer through until after the conference in Cape Town in September 9th to 12th. We will have a age-friendly cities and communities collaborative summit. We have pre-conferences, and we have 3.5 very full days, as well as an exploration day on the 8th, visiting various communities serving older people in South Africa. So I very much encourage you to come. Just been an extraordinary pleasure, as always, Rayne, to get to hang out with you and with all of our friends here at the Global Café. Thank you to Luana, and the last words are with you, Dr. Stroebel.
So I think what we know now, Gregor, is that there is so much that I think the world can learn from Africa. We always grew up that we all come from a cave somewhere. There is amazing research being done that doesn't make it into many of the top journals. So there is amazing research being done about this emergence, which I think the world can learn from, about the new solidarities, this kind of engagement across generations, across cultures. So I can just say, if you can at all, please come to the conference and engage in an African conference. And if you can't, go and look at the ILC website. Thank you. It's been put on the chat group. Someone asked about collaboration. Please, if you want to collaborate, there are many organizations working within research. I have to salute Professor Rayne Stroebel from UCT, the family caregiving. Incredible research is happening in this country and in sub-Saharan Africa. Please join us. Please collaborate. Just let me know.
Thank you very much, Rayne, and thank you to all of you. Wishing you a wonderful rest of your summer, and see you in Cape Town in September.
Rest of our winter, thank you, but see you on the other side.
Thank you, Bob. Cheers.